Welcome to session 4 of Archaeology in the Bible. Today we'll be talking about the Exodus and also the conquest of the Promised Land. When we finished off last session, we were discussing the movement of the family of Jacob to Egypt, and so that is basically where we pick up in the account of the Exodus. But first, I've had several folks, we talked about the importance of pottery, and they asked really how you can tell those differences and how you can date various time frames through the use of pottery finds. By no means am I an expert in this, but I did pull together a few things for you to look at, just to use as examples. So essentially we have here, this is just a representation of a Middle Bronze Age cooking pot. And we did discuss a little bit in a previous session the fact that one of the main turning points in the time frame for pottery is really between the early Bronze Age and the Middle Bronze Age. You have the development of the fast pottery wheel, where you actually have this wheel spinning, which allows a skilled potter to make a much more fancy pot, a much more axisymmetric pot. They can make pots that are a little bit thinner and still kind of control the quality of the pottery itself. So that's really a key distinction in the early bronze and the middle bronze timeframes. So you're looking at a cooking pot here from the middle bronze, and then we can compare that to some representations of some late Bronze Age cooking pots as well. You see a lot of similarities there. Obviously, a cooking pot in terms of function is going to be very similar, but you notice, especially in the areas where you have the rim, and that seems to be one of the key discriminators between the various time frames on pottery, is things like rims, handles, those sorts of things. And really, you don't see too many handles, or maybe not really any at all, in the early cooking pots. But by the time you get to the late bronze and later, you start to see some handles there. You start to see that the rims get a little bit more fancy, and so forth. So that's one way you can kind of determine those. Now let's also look real quick at the jar. This was kind of the common storage piece of pottery. Especially you find that Canaanite style jars would be used to ship things like olive oil and wine all over the Mediterranean. So they found Canaanite style jars as far away as parts of Africa, even not too far outside of France and Spain. So it was definitely basically it was a container that was used quite often in commerce. You might also have it in your home to store large amounts of some sort of a liquid. So we have here a Middle Bronze jar, and these would be fairly significant sized, anywhere from 2-3 feet, maybe even 4 feet tall, and maybe two feet in diameter. So this is the look of a Middle Bronze jar, and this is a particularly Canaanite style that you see. And then we look at some late Bronze jars. You'll notice they're a little bit more angular, not quite as rounded on the bottom. The handles are just a little bit different, so forth. So usually these kind of stylistic differences can sort of point you to the time frame that you're talking about when you're looking at one of these jars. And of course, you would have some sort of a stand for these. Really, a flat-bottomed jar normally breaks more easily than a round-bottomed jar, but of course it won't sit up on its own. So you see quite a few stands that these jars would have been put into, and in a few occasions you'll actually find that the owners would dig a hole If they had just a dirt floor, they would dig a hole and put the jar in that, and it was a good way to it was a good way to insulate it as well to keep things cool. So lots of different ways to attack that. But so you can see there's some relatively significant differences in the way these jars look. So it's not, if you're familiar with it, it's not terribly difficult to kind of make distinctions in those. So let's move on to our discussion topic tonight, which is Exodus and the Conquest. And as we mentioned earlier, our standard format, we're going to talk about some of the problems, either problems from interpreting the text itself, problems that have been brought up by critics, by academics, or just things we don't understand. Not going to guarantee we'll be able to explain them all, but we will at least take a harder look at them and explore some possibilities. So really the first one, and maybe even the big one in terms of the Exodus especially, is documentation. There's a great deal of criticism that says, why, if there were so many Hebrew slaves in Egypt, why is there no mention of them in the Egyptian records? Well, let's talk about what is in the Egyptian records. We have here this particular painting is from the tomb of Numhotep II, who was an official of one of the pharaohs, and it's been dated to sometime around 1900 BC. And what you see here is a number of Asiatic traders called Amu, perhaps Amorites, Canaanites, certainly Semites, and they are bringing kohl, Kohl, which is a substance that was used to make the eye paint that Egyptians like to use as a makeup type thing. Now, this painting actually identifies them as Asians, as Amu. It identifies that their leader is named Abishai, which is a name that you see over and over again as a Semitic or even Israeli name throughout the Old Testament. And another thing that's kind of interesting is you can see the distinction here that the Egyptians would generally have differing skin tones in their paintings for people from different lands, and so you'll find that skin tone, that kind of medium shade skin tone, seems to be the one that they used quite often for Asiatics, for Canaanites, people from east of Egypt. You can see in the upper right hand corner, that's the color of skin tone that normally you would see for a native Egyptian in a painting. Another thing that you find in these paintings is the hairstyles and such. So one of my professors likes to call this the Canaanite helmet type hairstyle, and also the beard. While you might see kind of a goatee on some Egyptians, normally they were clean shaven. And but you do see that these Asiatics, these Canaanites in the paintings, are almost always shown as having a full beard. So that's a distinction that we can make in there. Now, also in terms of the presence of and let's just say the presence of Semites, Semitic people in Egypt at this general time frame. Well, there are a number of archaeological sites in the northeastern portion of the Nile Delta that show pretty significant signs of Semitic or Canaanite settlements, and those stretch basically from about 1800 to about 1540 BC. Some of the things that lead the archaeologists to conclude that you see a lot of Canaanite style pottery. You start to see, and this is common in Canaanite villages and cities. You start to see lots of donkey burials and really burials and sacrifices. So that's a common thing that you see in Canaan, and you see it in this particular portion of Egypt as well. And there's multiple sites where you find this. Tel El Dabaa, Tel El Maksuta, But the one that I found very interesting is a location called Tel El Yahudayeh, which in Arabic means Mound of the Jew. And this is a location that is actually in Egypt. So there is quite a bit of evidence that there were Semitic people in Egypt in about this general time frame. Now, one of our real contentious type discussions is in terms of numbers and population. So let's talk just a little bit about that from the Exodus account. Really, we see in Exodus chapter 12, verses 37 and 38, and also in the book of Numbers, chapter 2, verse 32, puts the number of the men of Israel, basically the military age, the size of the army of Israel, at just about 600,000, which is an enormous number. And then the specialists, the scholars will tell you, well, if there's 600,000 men, there's probably somewhere, probably about that many women. And then once you factor in children, you're probably talking somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people total. That's an enormous grouping of people. And that is criticized for a number of different reasons. It's criticized because you started off with Jacob and his 12 sons a couple hundred years ago, and now there's like 2 million people. That seems unreasonable, and it does seem unreasonable. Also, some other criticisms are just that sheer size of people, the movement of them is difficult. Doesn't make sense. There are a lot of areas that are mentioned in the Exodus account and in the Conquest account where basically that many people just can't fit physically into the geographic locations that are discussed. So this is a real concern. But if we look a little harder at the scripture itself, a few things become apparent. In Exodus 12:38, the Bible calls the people a mixed multitude. So it's probably not unreasonable to think that while there may have been a reasonable number of descendants of Jacob in this grouping of people, when it calls them a mixed multitude, it could have been other people as well, other unrelated people who were from Canaan, and we'll see here in a little bit why that's quite likely. Also, another aspect that makes this sort of problematic is the fact that if the Israelite army was 600,000, that is much larger than any army that we know of that time frame. The very large and well-equipped Egyptian army in this general time frame that fought the Hittites was about 20 to 25,000. So it seems like it would be difficult to imagine the Egyptian army being 25, 30,000 people being, striking fear into the heart of an army of 600,000. Also, that number, 600,000, there have been some estimates of what the total population of Canaan at the general time frame here in the late Middle Bronze and early late Bronze Age time frame is. And this means that Israelite army was probably about 3 times the size of the total population of Canaan. That's men, women, and children over the entire land. So 600,000 seems to be a very high number. So, and in truth, with 600,000 people, such a large army wouldn't necessarily be needing God's help. So it's definitely a thing that we need to look at a little bit harder. And you also have examples. For example, Deuteronomy 9:1 says, "Hear, O Israel, you are to cross over the Jordan today to go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than you, cities great and fortified up to heaven." So again, 600,000 seems like a whole lot when you have other portions of the Bible telling you, oh, these other nations are greater than you, they're larger than you, they're mightier than you. So So there's some real difficulties here. One possible explanation, we have the Hebrew word Aleph, which is translated as thousands. So in the account in Exodus and Numbers, it is 600 Aleph. And so 600 Aleph is 600,000. Pretty straightforward. But what we find is, again, we don't have a good handle on full usage of words. We do find other examples where LF is used for meanings other than thousand, for meanings other than a strict counting number. It's also been used as a term for a family grouping. It's been used as a term for a military unit, like a squad or even a platoon. So it is conceivable, but by no means a definite, but it is very possible that 600 Aleph could mean 600 squads or 600 platoons and not 600,000. So we have to be conscious of this. We have to be cautious of changing meaning, but there is that alternative there. There's not really a clear way forward on this to this point. And so as a believer, you can kind of look at this and you can say, well, is it possible for God to sustain over 600,000 people in the wilderness? Well, sure it is. He can miraculously do all sorts of things. It doesn't make sense in some other aspects. So this may be one of those cases where we just say maybe we're not interpreting the biblical language the way we should be. All right, another problem that we deal with is in terms of evidence of destruction. A lot of critics will tell you we've looked at the archaeology of the promised land of Canaan, and the nation of Israel went in there and just wiped the whole place clean and set up housekeeping, and we don't find the widespread destruction that we would expect from that sort of thing. So what's going on with that? Well, again, it's never a bad thing to if you're going to be dealing with biblical archaeology to actually consult the Bible. So from the biblical account, if you read it directly, the text only mentions 3 cities during the conquest that were mentioned as having been destroyed and or burned, and those 3 cities were Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. And what we do know is that Jericho and Hatzor both have destruction layers. Now, there's argument about the timing of when those destruction layers occurred, and we'll talk about that a little bit here in just a minute. But they are there. There are examples in the history of those cities where those cities were destroyed in generally the late Middle Bronze, early late Bronze time period. Now the problem is with Ai, which is kind of in the middle there. That's really the big question, because there's an assumed location for Ai based on some things that scholars have looked into, and there is no destruction layer for the destruction from that particular site predates when anybody thinks the Exodus is by probably 500 years at least. So that just doesn't work. But there have been some archaeologists who have theorized that maybe we're in the wrong place. It's not like they've dug up a sign that says "Welcome to Ai." And about 6 or 8 miles away from this particular location is another archaeological site called Kirbet al-Maqadir, and it also could be Ai, and it does have a destruction layer at about the right time frame. And there's also some other things in the biblical account in terms of how the battle went around it that don't fit with the one location, but that fit fairly well with Kirbet al-Maqadir. So that one is still up for grabs. Now, also dating of events and chronology. Really, we like to try and put a pin in things and know more or less about when they were going to occur, and that it has been problematic again in this time period of the Exodus and the Conquest. There's huge disagreement on the chronology and the dating for both the Exodus and the Conquest, and they go right together. So lots of argument over who the Pharaoh of the Exodus is, and we may get into that deeper in another session. But in the book of First Kings, chapter 6, the historical discussion gives you an interval from the time of the Exodus to the building of Solomon's temple. So we think we know generally about when Solomon's temple was built, so we start counting backwards. And but you still have to make a few assumptions, and so you end up with some disagreements on the dating. You end up with some disagreements on the literalness of the number. Is a generation 40 years, is a generation 25 years, and basically everybody has their own interpretation, and their interpretation seems to fit whatever their pet theory is. If you ask 20 scholars, you'll probably get 25 different answers. So you have the discussion where people talk about the late Exodus, the middle Exodus, or the early Exodus, and that's based on how you interpret this span of years. And for the longest time, and even still to this day, the popular, if you want to say there's a leading or popular interpretation, it is of the late Exodus. And the problem in that was by about the 1950s, when Kathleen Kenyon of Wheeler Kenyon method of excavation, when Kathleen Kenyon was digging at Jericho, she found destruction of the walls, and she found destruction of the walls at a time that did not fit the late Exodus time frame, and that shook everyone up in the whole biblical archaeology world, because here we are. Looking at Jericho, we have a biblical account that said it was destroyed, and it wasn't destroyed when we thought it was. And before you know it, it becomes a standard thing for people to say, well, the story of Israel destroying Jericho, of marching around and God knocking down the walls, obviously a myth, because the archaeology doesn't support it. And this is assuming that Jericho fell sometime around, let's say, 1200 or so, maybe 1100 BC. However, you do find that Jericho's walls did collapse in about the 1400 1300 BC timeframe, which of course is much earlier than what was assumed. But depending on how you count, if you account for an early to mid Exodus, all of a sudden it hits about in that general time frame. So there's a lot of discussion that goes into this, and there's still huge disagreements, huge arguments about this. Lots of critics will say, well, it's the whole account of Jericho has been disproven. Doesn't really appear to be the case. It more looks like maybe we just need to look a little harder at our interpretations and our timings. So also we talked about synchronisms before, basically these points in history of different accounts in history, say the Egyptian history and the biblical history, where they might cross over and where they might go right along with each other. So let's talk about one, the Hyksos expulsion. We talked about the Hyksos a little bit last session, and how you had, for about 100 to 150 years, you had a group of pharaohs of Egypt who weren't even Egyptian. They were Semitic, they were Canaanites, and so they ruled Egypt for a little over 100 years, until they were driven out by Ahmose I, who was a native Egyptian pharaoh of Upper Egypt. And so basically, he pushed them out of Egypt and back into Canaan, and even pursued them into Canaan. Bear in mind, the Hyksos are noted for having been pretty militarily advanced. They introduced chariots and composite bows to this particular portion of the Mediterranean. But we see that if Amos drove the Hyksos out, these Semitic people, that does kind of line up fairly well with the verse in Exodus 1:8 that said, "And there arose a Pharaoh over Egypt who knew not Joseph." So if these Hyksos pharaohs had been Semites and were on good terms with the other Semitic peoples, then when the native Egyptians took back over, that may have been where part of that problem comes in. Then after this, we also see, because the Hyksos had been ruling over Egypt for about 100 years, the relations between the Egyptians and Canaan became very, very strained, very harsh. As I mentioned, the Egyptians pushed the Hyksos back into Canaan and pursued them, and basically laid waste to a large portion of Canaan, chasing after the Hyksos. And so you start to see lots of reports of military expeditions, occupations, essentially by this midpoint. Canaan kind of becomes just an annexed portion of Egypt, and the Egyptians levied very heavy taxes and tribute. So this kind of sets the stage to the rise of Semitic slavery. We talk about the Hebrews being slaves and so forth. Well, this is kind of that point. We have this particular scene from the tomb of Reckmeyer, who was the vizier of Tutmosis III, and that tends to be considered to be somewhere around 1479, 1425-ish BC. But this painting on a tomb wall shows slaves making mud bricks, which is something that you hear that you see in the Exodus accounts, was a common task that was put to the Hebrew slaves. And then because it's always nice to have a caption, the text right next to this particular painting says that these particular slaves were prisoners of war from the Southlands, and that's generally considered to be Nubia, and then also from the Northlands, which would be Canaan. And you can see kind of our differential skin colors there of these particular slaves. So you have at least a couple of them there that are more that kind of skin tone that we had mentioned was kind of used for people who were Asiatics or Canaanites. So you have this indication that there were at least some Semitic peoples in slavery in Egypt, and they were building or they were making mud bricks. Now we also have something called the Brooklyn Papyrus, and this particular papyrus is a ledger from a large Egyptian estate, and it has a list of all the servants, all the slaves on the property. And this has been dated to sometime around probably 1700 BC. And the fragment that we're able to read has over 40 Semitic, basically Hebrew or Canaanite type names on the listing as being servants or slaves in this particular Egyptian estate. So obviously there was a significant number. I think the total number of names that you can read on the fragment is about 90, and almost half of those were Semitic names. So obviously there were a significant number of Semitic slaves in Egypt at that time. Another thing that we find in some of the memorial inscriptions, some of the carvings, the monuments that the pharaohs would erect for themselves, we see lots of accounts of these pharaohs talking about their military campaigns into Canaan. And they even give you a bit of a laundry list of, I went into Canaan and I destroyed this city and I brought back this many thousand prisoners. And so there are just thousands upon thousands of Canaanites who are brought back to Egypt and put into slavery. It seems like those slaves quite often were slaves of the Pharaoh or of the government, working on government projects and so forth. But there would have also been some of these slaves who would have been in private ownership. One of the things that some of the studies seem to indicate is by this time frame in the early late Bronze Age, the population of Canaan appears to be anywhere from half to 75% smaller than it was in the Middle Bronze Age. Now, there are a lot of different things that could be driving that. Some of it is the famine and drought that we talked about last session, but there are also a significant number of people who are captured and brought to Egypt in slave raids. So this again contributes not only to kind of a depopulation of Canaan, but also into an increase in the population of Semites in this portion of Egypt. So there would have been a fairly significant number of those slaves at the time of the Exodus. Now let's transition from the Exodus to possibly the conquest. We have the Amarna letters and the Habaru. Again, this is an area that elicits a lot of discussion and argument. The Amarna was the capital of Akhenaten, who was a pharaoh of Egypt in the mid 1300s. And in 1887, archaeologists found the first, well, actually, locals found the first, and then archaeologists started to look after that. They found a series of clay tablets that turned out to be the archives for Akhenaten's diplomatic area. It was a lot of the diplomatic communication that had occurred between Egypt and its various neighbors. And there are a large number of these tablets that concern those client states, those occupied territories in Canaan. Most of these tablets, these letters, and there are over 300 of them, are written in Akkadian, which Akkadian was kind of the standard language that everybody used. No matter what your native language was, that was the written language, and a lot of times the spoken language that you used internationally and in commerce. So most of these are written in that language, which fortunately scholars are able to read. And the interesting thing is quite a few of these tablets that have survived are written as appeals to the pharaoh for help against someone called the Aparu or the Habaru. They're called both things. And a couple of the noteworthy ones, Amarna letter 271 is from Mikuli of Gezer, which is in Canaan in modern day Israel now, who is asking the pharaoh for aid against the power of the Aparu. And then in two different occasions, in Amarna letter 286 and Amarna letter 290 from Abdi Heba, who was the ruler over what would later become Jerusalem, he writes to warn the pharaoh that unless the pharaoh sends troops, particularly archers, that his lands, the pharaoh's lands, will be lost to the Aparu. And so Aparu, Habaru, those are both kind of forms of this word. There is a large debate about about the Habaru. Obviously, the name is very close to Hebrew. A lot of linguists will tell you it's basically identical to Hebrew in that sense. And so a lot of people have just pointed to that and said, "Oh, Habaru, Hebrew, there you go. You know, it's the people of Israel." However, that word Habaru was in use long before this. Habaru was basically a Canaanite word. It had a lot of significance to it. A lot of the uses seem to mean kind of bandit or outlaw. It's people who are kind of living on the fringes of society, almost like a robber band or something like that. Not really an ethnicity, not really a tribe of people or something like that. It was more talking about a type of people or even a behavior type style. So for a long time, scholars basically just kind of rejected this whole thing and said this has nothing to do with Israel because Habaru doesn't mean Hebrew. And we have to consider that at this time of the Exodus and the conquest, Israel didn't really have an identity. They wouldn't have even called themselves Hebrew or whatever. They were still kind of trying to figure themselves out. So it's not necessarily the case that they would have even identified themselves this way. But interestingly enough, recent scholarship has been a little bit more open to the notion that the Israelites were Habaru. Now, the distinction they make now is, I guess, what they would say is not all Habaru were Israelites, but perhaps all Israelites were Habaru. If you're settled in a city and these nomadic people come rolling up and they're trying to take your place, it would not be uncommon to call them Habaru, to call them bandits or marauders or whatnot. And we don't know that there may have been other people groups kind of along with them. So you see lots of examples of that. Nonetheless, this is still a very much of a hot button issue among academics. You can get biblical scholars going in a big way if you just kind of toss that one out there and let them fight each other. But it is a remarkable coincidence. It is a thing that's at least interesting to be aware of. So now our other aspect of format that we wanted to continue on with was cultural specificities. Those little pieces of culture that we find from uh, some of our discoveries, some of our artifacts that really give you a picture of what life was like in that particular area. So we've talked a little bit about this before, but let's talk about mud bricks. This was the common building material of the area. Now, in Exodus chapter 5, we see that the Hebrew slaves are in a bad spot because they've angered Pharaoh, and he basically says, "Okay, now you're going to have to make bricks without straw." So, really, what does that mean? Well, the straw was quite often used as a reinforcement, as kind of a binder for the mud to make the bricks a little bit more durable. It not only does it act kind of like a reinforcement, almost like rebar and concrete, but also as the straw breaks down, it has some kind of substance that seems to also benefit the hardness of the mud bricks. Now, this was a method that was very common in Egypt, but there are a lot of other areas in the Near East that do not use this method. So it certainly wasn't universal, but it was something that would have been common to Egypt. And remember, in Exodus 5, they were told they weren't going to be provided straw. They were going to have to go out and get their own straw or build the bricks without straw, which would have meant they would have been rejected. So just to give ourselves a little bit of a feel for how widespread the use of mud bricks was, we have many discoveries of texts. Papyrus Anastasi #1 has a mathematics problem on it that was used by a student to calculate the number of bricks needed to build a construction ramp of a certain size, and it was thousands. Um, and we see in the Exodus account, it speaks of the Hebrews being in trouble because they didn't meet their quota. Well, there is a leather text, a leather document that is currently in the Louvre in Paris. It's called the Louvre leather roll, and it actually records a job that went on that required the making of mud bricks in Egypt in about the same general time frame. And it specifically talks about the number of workers, who failed to meet their quota, the amount they were short, and so forth. And then to go right along with that, Papyrus Anastasi #4 contains a complaint to a higher official about a supervisor who says, "I don't have enough workers and I don't have enough straw to make my required brick quota." So again, we see quite a few examples that kind of line up with the account as it's given in Exodus 5. Let's talk about babies in a basket. We have the story of Moses, and one of the big discussion points in biblical archaeology is we know that there is a parallel story in Mesopotamia that is attributed to the birth of Sargon of Akkad, or Sargon the Great, who was a big king who conquered a great deal of Mesopotamia, who was supposed to have lived somewhere around 2371 to 2316 BC. So much, much earlier than the time frame that we're talking about for the Exodus. So a lot of critics will look at this and they'll say, well, you've got this story of Sargon. Obviously, this was copied in the Bible in the account of Moses, because we see in the story of Sargon, there is a basket. There's a I think the mother was like a priestess who wasn't supposed to have a child, so she puts the child in a basket, and the child floats down the river and is found by someone and raised in their household. So they say, look at this. This is just copied. A few things that make it a little bit more problematic. The earliest known accounts of the birth story of Sargon are from somewhere around 5 to 600 BC, which actually, depending on what your position on the documentary hypothesis is, the Hebrew scriptures would have already been written by that time. Now, even though Sargon supposedly lived in the 2300s BC, it doesn't seem like any of that was written down until much, much later, as far as we can tell. And really, what it seems like is the popularity of telling Sargon's birth story really got a boost when Sargon the Second, in that later time frame, decided he was going to take that same name. So we have that, and then also something just in the story of Moses as a child, as a baby. That is noteworthy to mention is in this particular portion of Exodus, well, and throughout Exodus really, but in this particular portion especially, you see a lot of borrowed Egyptian words. You see words that really aren't Hebrew, or that are words that are used in Hebrew that come from Egyptian words. So you have the word tebat, which it derives directly from an Egyptian word for basket. You have gomeh, which is comes from the Egyptian word for bulrushes. You have soup, which is the Egyptian word for reeds. Hayor, which is used for river. It is not the normal Hebrew word for river. It actually is a transliteration of the Egyptian word for the Nile. So this isn't somebody just saying, okay, they put him in the river. They are specifically talking about the Nile. So there's a lot of crossover here with Egyptian that just seems to really line up with the story itself. Now, we talked a little bit about this in previous session, but let's talk about covenant language and language of agreement in this time frame, and kind of the late bronze, the early late bronze age portion. So, really, the biggest covenant language of them all is the Mosaic Covenant, the agreement between God and His people. And that is mentioned multiple places. The terms of it are mentioned in Exodus, in Leviticus, and in Deuteronomy. And one of the things that has been very striking in all of this is that the Mosaic Covenant, as written in the Bible, has all the features of a Hittite suzerainty treaty. Basically, if you were going to be a part of the Hittite Empire, this was the treaty that you had to sign with them to be a part. And those treaties, and like we talked about last session, there's a time frame here. These standard formats seem to change from time to time, and so this seems to hit the general features of a Hittite treaty from about 1400 to about 1200 BC. It has pretty much everything, and almost pretty much in order. You have title and preamble, you have a historical prologue, you have stipulations, you have the depositing text or the reading out of what you're going to do, you have the witnesses, you have the blessings and the curses. And so it goes in that particular time frame or in that particular order. And so it matches very closely. And again, just like we saw in the Middle Bronze Age, if you look at a treaty of a few hundred years before that, or a treaty of a few hundred years after that, the format is just different enough in structure that it really doesn't fit. It kind of puts the Mosaic Covenant in that particular time frame of about 1400 to about 1200 BC. And last, and this was one we talked about before too, but let's talk about the price of a slave. So we did talk about in the Middle Bronze Age that Joseph was sold for 20 shekels. Well, we see in the Mosaic Law, particularly in Exodus 21:32, it tells you that if you have injured someone's slave or accidentally killed someone's slave, then the replacement price you have to pay them is 30 shekels. Now, is that a legitimate price? Well, one thing we find in the records of Nuzi, which is a portion of what's now Syria from the 15th century, and also in Ugarit, which is in kind of Lebanon area now from the 14th century, so 1400, 1300 BC timeframe, it shows that the price of a slave was generally in the 30 shekel range. So again, we're finding that whoever was writing this in the Mosaic the Mosaic Law, we assume Moses, happened to know how much a slave was going for in that general time frame. Because if you look at how much a slave went for, even a couple of hundred years later, it is drastically different. And that finishes us up. Let's talk a little bit about references. If you're really interested in the Exodus, possibly one of the best books, and it's not a very expensive book either, especially if you get it used, is Israel and Egypt, Evidence for the Authenticity of the Exodus Tradition by James Hoffmeyer. It's also a pretty straightforward read, has a lot of good support to it, gives you a lot of good references to go investigate. And then we also have our standards. We have On the Reliability of the Old Testament from Kenneth Kitchen, and he has a section on the Mosaic Covenant and Hittite treaties that will go into. It'll make your eyes water at just how much detail he goes into on these various treaties and how they line up with the Mosaic Covenant. And then finally, again, the Harvest Handbook of Bible Lands is a good general reference to use. Now, next week or in the next session, we will be moving to the time of the Judges and the time of the Kingdom.